What's going on, guys? It's Cimo. So today I'm bringing to you my top 5 rogue decks for the January 2019 format. Now, we've already covered the top 5 meta decks and the top 5 budget decks, but rogue decks fall into a very specific niche. Now, these are decks that you might see take a top or two at a YCS, but aren't necessarily the decks that a lot of people are expecting to go up against. You know, the meta's already been defined, we know what that's going to be, but these are still 5 decks that have a very good shot at possibly winning a YCS and have actually been doing a fairly decent job on the regional scene. So if you're looking to maybe shake up the format a little bit and play something a little bit different than what most people are abiding by, or if you're a competitive player and want to know what you might possibly expect at a high tier event, this video has something for everyone. But before we get into it, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you guys don't miss a single upload. And if you really love the content that I produce on this channel, then consider supporting me on Patreon or becoming a YouTube channel member, because it's thanks to people like Toasted Waffle and Andreas that I'm able to bring you this content on a daily basis. So if you're interested, hit the join button down below or check out the links in the description. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get right into it. Starting off with number 5, we have True Draco. Now, I almost put True Draco on the top 5 budget decks for this format, but I kind of felt that there were some other decks that just pretty much outclassed it, just because True Draco's fallen by the wayside due to the way it matches up against some of these particular decks. I mean, yes, True Draco has a lot of good things going for it. I mean, you have a deck that plays a million draw spells. You probably have access to some of the best draw spells in this game, and you're able to play all of them in one single deck. So the amount of consistency you have there is crazy. Not to mention, the True Draco's cards themselves are just fantastic. Being able to generate advantage during your opponent's turn when they activate card effects, and the cards you're able to get from that, like stuff like Heritage or Return. I mean, there's just so many powerful cards in the True Draco archetype. This deck has been around for so long. Not to mention, there's a pretty good shot that this deck isn't really going to get touched by the ban list anytime soon, just because it hasn't really been doing too well, and so it's kind of in like a very good roguish-esque place, and I think that suits the deck very well. I mean, it's a stun deck, so you know, you're trying to stun your opponent out as hard as possible and really just stun the meta. But I think the biggest downside to a deck like True Draco is the fact that it doesn't really stack up well against some of the best meta contenders at the moment. I mean, Rivalry of Warlords is one of its key stun cards, and while the card is still very powerful, a lot of the decks in the meta now are comprised of like a single type, so it's not nearly as potent as it used to be, although there are some decks it can still match up very well against. But then you also have the side deck going into games 2 and 3. You know, one of the big things when it comes to rogue decks is that people aren't prepared to side against your deck, and that gives you an inherent advantage going into the later stages of the match. And the thing is with True Draco, you really just need a ton of spell and trap removal, and people are already playing that because Altergeist is in the meta and because Sky Striker's in the meta, so it's really not hard for players to pivot, use those same cards against Draco, and it doesn't really give you any upper hand. So it's still a very good deck for what it is. It's been able to top regionals left and right, and it even got a YCS top not too long ago, but it's one of those decks that's definitely fallen out of favor, but definitely not one that you should forget. Now, speaking of decks you don't want to forget, that brings us on to number 4, Paleozoic. Paleozoic is one of those decks that always just manages to keep its head lingering in the meta in some way. It's pretty much always been around ever since it was a tier 1 contender only just a few years back, but Paleozoic is still going strong. Now, when you look at it compared to something like Altergeist, obviously Altergeist is pretty much shown to be the better deck just in terms of results overall, but it doesn't mean Paleozoic doesn't have its own strengths. I mean, you're able to generate incremental advantage off of every single trap card that you play, which helps the deck snowball and achieve its win condition a lot more quickly. Its win condition is centralized in the extra deck being totally awesome, because as soon as you start establishing those toads, you're going to lock your opponent out of being able to play any of their best cards, and that's pretty much when you've just established full control of the game, and that's how Paleozoic wins. Paleozoic is an incredibly resilient deck. The thing is, you know, very similarly to something like True Draco, I think the biggest issue with this deck lies in the side deck, and that people already have the tools to combat a deck like Paleozoic at the ready. I mean, people are already side decking Twin Twisters, Red Reboot, evenly matched. Denko Sekka, Thunder Dragon has Denko Sekka in the side deck. So the fact that there's all these cards that players already have at their disposal because they want to use it for decks like Altergeist, because they want to use it for Sky Striker, I think that's what really holds the deck back, because as incredibly powerful as Paleozoic is, when your opponent already has the necessary tools to combat it in the side deck, it doesn't really give you any sort of advantage. And then you look at something like Altergeist, and Altergeist just kind of seems like to be the better deck because it just has more favorable matchups when you look at it in terms of Sky Striker, Thunder Dragon, and the rest of the overall meta representation. So Paleozoic, you know, it's still hanging in there. It actually just topped a regional this past weekend, so it's not like it's gone completely unnoticed, but definitely something you should maybe think about lingering in the back of your head. Now, coming in at number 3, we have a deck you definitely should not have forgotten about already, and that is Slash Draw FTK. Now, the reason I put Slash Draw FTK in here is because now that the strategy has been known since YCS Milan took place, this is a deck that pretty much everyone already has on their radar because there hasn't been any ban list changes, so Slash Draw FTK is still definitely a viable option. For those of you who don't know, Slash Draw FTK basically takes advantage of an entire danger deck where you're just drawing and turboing through your entire deck, hoping to ultimately get to Slash Draw, and that way you can resolve Slash Draw by giving your opponent a Grinder Golem, nuking the entire board, and then you're just gonna win on the very first turn of the game, with your opponent basically having zero interaction whatsoever. Now, the reason I want to bring this up is because YCS Milan was, you know, a while ago relatively, but it's something that is gone completely untouched and could be relatively under the radar, and having just basically whatever hand traps at your disposal is what you're going to need to combat this deck. Because remember, it's an FTK. If you don't have hand traps or anything to just stop it if you're going second, you're just automatically going to lose. And the scary thing about Slash Draw FTK and kind of this danger decks in general is that even if they go second and aren't able to resolve the FTK, they're just going to be able to kill you because dangers just have so much power behind them. They have so much draw power with stuff like Allure of Darkness, Beginning of the End, and they can just play the beatdown game where they're just going to completely annihilate you by summoning card after card after card, drawing through their whole deck. You're going to eventually run out of resources, and then they're just going to swing in for a shitload of damage, and that's really it. This is a deck that I didn't want to necessarily put in the higher tiers because I think it kind of fell short by Milan standards. I mean, only like 1 or 2 of it topped, and it's something that again kind of wasn't nearly as prolific as the original Danger Dark World FTK, which was insanely more consistent, but it's still something you do not want to forget about, or, you know, maybe if you want to have some fun, something you might want to try out for yourself, because if you're playing in a specific tournament environment where players aren't respecting it, they're not playing cards like Droll and Lockbird or, you know, Ghost Reaper and Winter Cherries, or any card that just pretty much outright stops the deck, you could honestly just win that event very easily, so it's definitely something to consider. Now moving on to number 2, we've got good old Burning Abyss. Yes, you guys knew Burning Abyss had to make it on this list, you know, or one of these lists somewhere, because Burning Abyss is undoubtedly the deck that will not die. Burning Abyss just has so many good things going for it. I mean, the amount of consistency this deck bleeds is kind of disgusting, because realistically, as long as you just have a handful of Burning Abyss monsters, you're good to go. I mean, with Sekka's Light pretty much bringing this deck into a whole new light, being able to have 3 copies of Pot of Greed at your disposal, but then also having all the really cool tools of like playing stuff like Kaijus and being able to stop Sky Strikers and then just go in and OTK them. You've got stuff like Blackluster Soldier, which for some reason is at 3 copies. I still don't understand why. You have Orbital Hydrolander, which is a crazy boss monster, very difficult for your opponent to deal with in some circumstances. Burning Abyss just has so many powerful tools at the ready, not to mention you have Dante, which is arguably one of the greatest Xyz monsters ever printed, and Beatrice to follow that up, which can be a threat for any deck, regardless of where it stands in the meta. Burning Abyss's adaptability to specific metas is really just unbelievable, and honestly, it's been able to top YCS's left and right. At the moment, it's kind of gone under the radar again, but it doesn't mean people are still trying to pretty much make it do what it does best. people are incorporating dangers. Like, there's just so many good synergistic cards that Burning Abyss can play that it has to be on this list. And honestly, don't be surprised that if YCS Sydney or maybe even at YCS Chicago, if Burning Abyss manages to garner a couple of those top cut slots. So this brings us to my number one rogue deck of the January 2019 format. And if you haven't already figured it out, I'm actually going with Trickstar. Now, Trickstar is one of those decks that a lot of people have a love-hate relationship with, but Trickstar has managed to survive it all, and honestly, it's probably done the best out of most of the decks on this list. I mean, it made second place at YCS London. It was able to tear through all the other competitors there. Trickstar just has the ability to just be very flexible. Again, very similar to something like Burning Abyss, but because Trickstar's engine is so condensed, you can play a lot of crazy different strategies with it, and it's honestly not a bad option. I mean, there's people messing around still with Sky Striker Trickstar, there's Artifact Trickstar, which has actually been taking off because Scythe is just an incredibly powerful tool to be used against certain matchups. Pretty much 90% of the metagame loses to Scythe outside of like Altergeist, so that's something really good. So by incorporating all these different engines with your Trickstar engine, you have a really aggressive component with the Trickstars, and then you've got more like control-y aspects with stuff like Sky Strikers, Artifacts, whatever it is you really want to mesh with the deck, and it's able to play so many floodgates as well. It can play a very defensive control-y game, but it can also be heavily offensive based, so having that adaptability and flexibility, I really got to give Trickstar credit where credit is due, and it's been able to get like at least one top cut slot at the past few YCSs, not to mention it's still doing incredibly well on the regional scene. I mean, its matchups are all fairly decent aside from Thunder Dragon, so if Thunder Dragon manages to take off and, you know, do a lot better than it currently is, Trickstar is definitely going to keep falling out of favor, but it's got a good Sky Striker matchup, got a good Altergeist matchup. It's just pretty solid across the board, and that's why I had to give it the number one slot. But guys, those are just my thoughts. Let me know down in the comments what you guys think about your top rogue decks for the January 2019 format. I'd really love to hear your thoughts. So guys, thank you so much for watching the video. Be sure to like the video as always, subscribe to the channel for more amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content, and if you found this video helpful, consider supporting me on Patreon or becoming a YouTube channel member, because just by showing your support in any way that you can, you're investing in my ability to continue bringing you amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. So thanks so much again, and we'll see you next time.